I'm Jim Stanford, economist and director of the Center for Future Work in Vancouver. Donald Trump's aggressive and erratic announcements about tariffs and other trade policies pose some incredible threats to Canada's economy and indeed to our future as a country. In this video, I'm going to first of all debunk Trump's lies about the Canada-U.S. trade relationship, and in particular his false claim, that America subsidizes Canada through our trade. In fact, I argue it's the other way around. Then I'll talk about the likely impacts on Canada's economy if Trump goes ahead with the tariffs that he has threatened. And then finally, talk about some of the things that Canada needs to do to respond to Trump and protect our economy and our sovereignty. I'm going to be speaking from a new report from our Center for Future Work called Who's Subsidizing Whom? I'm very proud of the proper Canadian grammar on that, whom. My English teacher would be proud. You can find that on our website. And also, please follow us on all the social media platforms. So Donald Trump's threats obviously causing unprecedented uncertainty and danger to the world order, economically and diplomatically, and in terms of world peace and geopolitics. He has shown that he's willing to use unabashed power of America, being the biggest economy and the biggest military power, to blackmail other countries to doing what he wants on anything, whether it's relevant to international trade issues or not. We are all trying to make sense of what Trump's end game is. Is he just creating leverage so he can bargain for concessions on issues like the border or defense spending, or he and his techno-bro oligarch friends like Elon Musk hate Canada's digital services tax, a 3% tax that we're imposing on cross-border digital services? Maybe they're just going to try and make concessions in those areas. On the other hand, he's talking about making Canada the 51st state and expanding America's territory in other ways as well. Panama, Greenland, Gaza. So either way, Canada's in trouble here, because even if it's the optimistic scenario, Trump is showing that he will use economic power to get what he wants from us. And this is dangerous to our economy and to our sovereignty. He claims that America is subsidizing Canada, that Canada is somehow exploiting the U.S. through our bilateral trade relationship. And he throws all kinds of made-up numbers around that are just false. So we're going to challenge those claims, and we're going to show that, if anything, Canada subsidizes the U.S., not the other way around. And America certainly benefits at least as much as Canada does from the huge two-way flow of trade. This shows the American trade deficit over time. Trump has talked a lot about how the deficit is a sign of American crisis and justifies some of the emergency measures that he's taking. The United States has run a trade deficit for 49 straight years, and it's a safe bet that 2025 will make it 50 in a row. It is a structural feature of the U.S. economy. There's nothing new about it, and it's not an emergency. In fact, the overall U.S. trade deficit, measured as a share of GDP, has been smaller in recent years, around 3% of American GDP, than it was in the past. It was about 5% of American GDP in the 2000s. So the claim that this is an emergency that justifies all of these executive orders that he wakes up in the morning and signs, nonsense. This reflects how the U.S. relates to the rest of the world economy, in particular, the giant annual inflow of capital from other countries to the United States in all kinds of ways, buying government bonds, investing in the U.S. stock market or derivatives, buying U.S. property. The rest of the world loves to put money into U.S. assets because the U.S. is the center of world capitalism. And that gives the Americans more money to spend than they have generated through their own production. So this trade deficit is a normal feature in the U.S. Not only can he not claim that the trade deficit is an emergency, he certainly can't blame Canada for it. The actual number of the bilateral trade deficit, he throws out numbers, 100 billion, 200 billion, 300 billion. The numbers change every day. The actual number, based on U.S. official data, is 40 billion in 2023, and it shrank in 2024. We don't have the year-end numbers yet. And that ranked Canada as the 10th largest bilateral trade deficit among major U.S. trading partners. So, yes, Canada sold about $40 billion a year more of goods and services to America than America sold back to Canada. So that's the bilateral deficit for the Americans, and it's a bilateral surplus for us It is small relative to other countries, 1/6 the size of the deficit with China, 1/4 the size of the deficit with Mexico. It's also very small relative to the huge two-way flow of goods and services that cross the border every year. About $1 trillion a year in goods and services goes north or south between Canada and the United States. It's the biggest trading relationship in the world. And that $40 billion deficit, 40 billion sounds like a big number, but it's small relative to $1 trillion. And in fact, the balance of trade going both ways between Canada and the U.S. is quite close. On average, America sold about 92 cents to us for every dollar that we sold to them. And that's much more balanced than the American trade with other countries. Most of its other trading partners have much bigger imbalances as a share of the total trade. With China, for example, they only sell about 40 cents to China for every dollar that they take back from China. With Mexico, it's about 70 cents. With Canada, it's 92 cents. So they're getting a very good opportunity. And Canada is the biggest market for American exports of goods and services. Donald Trump has said he doesn't need anything from Canada, and of course that is nonsense. They purchase over $500 billion a year of goods and services from us, and they are an essential input to the operation of the U.S. economy. We've obviously heard a lot about Canada's energy exports to the United States, particularly oil, but also natural gas, electricity, and other forms of energy. And those are vital inputs. In fact, Canada supplies over half of all of America's imported oil. Over 4.5 million barrels a day goes to the United States. And that has expanded dramatically since we signed the original free trade agreement with the U.S. Back in the late 1980s. So if this was to be cut off for some reason, and to be clear, no one's suggesting that it should be, but if it was, America would face an energy crisis that made the 1970s disruptions with OPEC and a war in the Middle East and everything, when people had to line up around the block at gas stations, it would make that look like child's play. They absolutely need our energy, but it isn't just our energy. If you look across the board at what we sell to the Americans, 76% of what we sell are not finished products that show up on the shelves at Costco, but actual inputs that are purchased by American businesses in their production for all their markets, including stuff they produce for American markets, but also stuff they produce for export, including exports back to us in Canada. So 76% of our imports, if they get a big tariff on them, are just going to make costs more expensive for American businesses and create disruption and job loss in America. Remember, it is Americans who pay a tariff, not Canada. We would suffer the consequences of that tariff, but it is Americans and largely American businesses. So it's our energy, but it's other minerals, forestry products, agricultural commodities, machinery, semi-finished goods, and so on. Only about 1/4 of our exports to the U.S. are finished products, including passenger cars, which are a big industry in Canada. The other 3/4 are used by American businesses. So Donald Trump is really shooting America in the foot here with this policy. In fact, in both feet. Number one, they're going to cripple their biggest single export market. If Canada's economy is damaged, then we won't buy as much from America. Number two, in the other foot, they're going to make their own businesses less competitive and less successful because they're going to make those inputs all the more expensive. Donald Trump always talks about merchandise and throws out these numbers about the merchandise trade balance, goods that come in on container ships or trucks. But services are a large and important and rapidly growing part of international trade. And Donald Trump never talks about never talks about services. Why not? Because the Americans have a lock on international trade and services because they've got the biggest, most powerful companies, the biggest banks, the biggest technology companies, the biggest telecom companies, the biggest transportation companies. So funny how he doesn't talk about that. America has a big trade surplus in services with Canada, over $30 billion in 2023, and that counted as the second largest trade surplus of any country. Ireland is the biggest trade surplus in services, but that's artificial because what that is big American companies like Microsoft and Apple have created Irish subsidiaries in order to take advantage of Ireland's unusually low corporate tax rate. It's the lowest corporate tax rate in Europe. So they are exporting to their own subsidiaries in Ireland artificial things like intellectual property payments or management fees, consulting fees, etc., as a way of shifting their profits to a low-tax jurisdiction. So Ireland doesn't really count as a true services export. In Canada's case, those are real services that Canadians are buying. And if anything, we aren't counting a lot of the cross-border services, especially digital services. Everything from Google to Meta to Netflix to Uber bookings, none of those really show up in the official trade statistics. So the U.S. surplus in services trade is even bigger than the official numbers indicate. Now, Donald Trump has claimed that a trade deficit for them is a subsidy to us, that they're giving us money. And this is nonsense. If anything, it is the Americans who depend on money flowing into their country in order to continually, year after year after year, buy more than they produce. There are all kinds of factors that can explain why trade deficits or imbalances arise and why they can last for a long time. Some of it is macroeconomic. If your country is growing faster than other countries, then you're naturally going to buy more from them, and that has been happening with the U.S. They have had the strongest economic recovery after COVID than any other industrial country. You could have very bad trade policies or unbalanced exchange rate or a general lack of competitiveness in your business. That could cause a trade deficit for a while. Ultimately, if a trade deficit is going to last a long time, as America's has, you have to have ongoing flows of capital that are coming into the country that allow the country to pay for that deficit. In other words, to allow them to buy more than they sell. And that ongoing capital flow is vital in the U.S. case because they have had that trade deficit for half a century. So the deficit itself is not a subsidy to us, but if we look carefully at the nature of the two-way trade, we can see some very surprising and unusual ways that America is getting a sweet deal from their trade with Canada, a sweet deal that really does constitute a subsidy. Three of them that we identify in our paper, who's subsidizing whom. The first is energy exports to the U.S., particularly oil. It is a huge flow of oil, and it's priced well below world prices for all kinds of reasons, about infrastructure, about capacity, about quality, and so on. But whatever the factors are, they're getting about $20 billion a year savings buying our oil for less than they would have to pay at the world price. Secondly, those services exports, many of them, as I mentioned, especially digital services, are not counted in the trade data. They aren't regulated adequately in our system because of the cross-border digital flows. And importantly, for the most part, they are not taxed. So those enormously profitable companies, all of the technology giants whose CEOs were sitting in the front row at Trump's inauguration, they are, for the most part, able to avoid taxes in Canada because of how easy it is for them to shift their accounting profits from one jurisdiction to another. Now, we're trying to offset that with this new digital services tax, 3% on revenues, not very much, and the Americans are going nuts about that. That will be the first thing that they try to get rid of if we actually sit down to negotiate a new trade agreement with them. But the reality is those companies don't pay taxes. Other companies do pay taxes, so that's a subsidy. The third one, very unusual, is the fact that we pay about $13 billion a year net to the Americans in interest, profit, and dividend, income on investments. Investment income does not show up in the trade balance per se, but it is part of our balance of payments. And there's a lot that goes both ways. There's investment income that comes back to Canada from Canadian-owned investments in the U.S., but there's even more that goes from the U.S., from Canada to the U.S., based on American investments in Canada. And the net flow is about $13 billion a year. What makes this unusual is the actual investment balance is in Canada's favor now. For about a decade, Canadian companies and banks and investors have owned more property in the U.S. than the Americans own in Canada. And that's quite a shift from the early days in Canada when we were very dependent on U.S. foreign investment. Now, we own more of America. Yet, despite that, we are paying $13 billion a year in net interest, profits, and dividends going south rather than north. And this is part of that mechanism that I discussed where international capital flows is what allows America to run a trade deficit year after year after year after year for 49 straight years. Money has to be coming into the country so that they can do that. And Canadians have done their bit to help out the Americans, okay? The Americans have their hand out saying, give us money so that we can keep buying your stuff. And we have done it. This shows the huge expansion in Canadian-owned U.S. debt, everything from treasury bills from the government to corporate bonds and other forms of U.S. debt, and now almost $700 billion that Canadians own. That increase in debt actually offsets or matches the cumulative trade deficit that America has run with Canada. So with Canada, like the rest of the world, the only way America can continually consume more than they produce, buy more than they sell, is if we lend them money. And Canada's been doing that. And ironically, despite that, we pay them net interest, profits, and dividends. It would be like you going to the bank to get a mortgage and then asking the bank to pay you interest rather than the other way around. In the real world, that's not how it works. But in Canada-U.S. trade, that's exactly what's happening. And that is the very unusual third way that Canada subsidizes the U.S., not the other way around. Let's talk about what happens if Trump goes ahead with the tariffs that he has threatened. He changes the date, he changes the amount, he changes the targets every morning when he wakes up, and it's a sure sign that America is heading towards autocracy. If one man can make all of these unilateral decisions and concentrate so much power without debate in Congress or approval or anything else, and we're seeing that, of course, in many other frightening ways in America as Trump consolidates his rule. What would the impacts be on Canada of the tariffs? Well, the direct impact, remember, it is Americans who would pay their tariff. It is the importing agent or company or consumer, even small packages that are ordered online when they cross the border will have to pay that tariff. But what it means for us is it makes our stuff more expensive in the eyes of American consumers, but 25% more expensive if that's what he ends up doing. If Americans have the opportunity to switch their purchases to other suppliers that don't have the 25% tariff, then the quantity sold will fall, no doubt about it. Or it could be that Americans will say, well, I'll keep buying your stuff, but you have to cut your price by 25%. So either we're going to lose sales in quantity or lose revenue in price. It depends what happens with the other countries. Now, Trump is saying he's going to tariff everybody, in which case the impact on Canada might be a bit muted, but we'll see. It's possible in some cases, that's clearly the case with energy, that the Americans will just have to pay the higher price because they can't get the stuff anywhere else. It's also true of aluminum, steel, many critical minerals, many agricultural commodities where they absolutely need Canada stuff. Even in value-added industries like the auto sector, the industry in North America has been one industry, not three separate national industries, one industry for 60 years, going back to the Auto Pact in the 1960s. So they absolutely need our auto parts and our finished vehicles. But even the parts, if that was shut off or became too expensive, American auto assembly plants would have to shut down. So if they can't switch to an alternate source of supply, which in many cases is not possible, at least in the short and medium run, then they'll have to pay the higher price. They will get higher inflation in the United States as a result, possibly higher interest rates, although Donald Trump has threatened to fire the governor of the Federal Reserve as part of his move to centralize all power in his own hands. Remember, 3/4 of what we sell the Americans is sold to American businesses. So it is American businesses who will become more expensive, less competitive, less successful. One thing to keep in mind is we have a flexible exchange rate. We have a Canadian dollar that trades up and down against the U.S. dollar, and that will give us a bit of protection. Not fully, but the Canadian dollar will fall. That will make it more expensive to buy things from America or to travel to Florida. It will give another incentive to buy Canadian, but it will offset some of the impact of the tariffs. In fact, in the last year, the Canadian dollar has fallen already by about 8% relative to the U.S. dollar, partly because of interest rate differentials, but partly because of fears about Trump. And that offsets 1/3 of his 25% tariff right there. So interesting. And we'll have to follow the Canadian dollar, and it's going to be very important in helping us survive this. The indirect or flow-through impact of higher U.S. tariffs in a way will be the bigger problem. Not just that it makes our stuff more expensive in the short run, but for businesses, whether they're Canadian-owned or global businesses, it suddenly becomes very questionable whether you want to locate your production in Canada if you're going to sell much or all of your stuff in the U.S. market, because you don't know what Trump's going to do tomorrow. Trump said explicitly when he spoke to the World Economic Forum in Davos in late January, he said explicitly his goal here is to force companies around the world to come to America if they want to sell in America. And even if he doesn't go ahead with the tariffs, the fact that he's threatening to do it, and we don't know what he's going to do next month or next year, is going to lead to a lot of investment mobility leaving places like Canada and going to the United States. And we're already seeing evidence that companies are losing orders and they're putting investment plans on hold because they don't know what Trump is going to do. So the combination of reduced exports and lost investment, and then the investment problem could be the bigger one in the long run. It's clearly going to create a recession in Canada. Many economists have tried to model it, including the Bank of Canada. They expect a very significant decline in GDP in the first year of the tariffs, and then another more moderate decline for at least one more year after that. We'd likely see 1 million jobs or more lost initially in the export industries, but spreading through the rest of the economy through trickle-down impacts. If an export industry closes, well, then all of the domestic service and consumer goods industries that depended on that mine or that auto plant or that technology center, all of those industries, from donut stores to restaurants to home builders to dry cleaners, are going to lose work. This would not be as deep a hit as we experienced during the pandemic, but it would last longer than the pandemic. We could also see an impact on inflation in Canada for various reasons, including tariffs that we would likely impose in response to Trump and the impact of the lower dollar. So this will be a very, very serious impact on Canada, and we're going to need emergency responses from government in all kinds of ways to help us get through it. In terms of the actual trade response, the kind of tit-for-tat approach to trying to push back at Trump's threats and Trump's attacks, clearly we need to be ready to hit back if we're going to have any leverage in negotiating a way out of this at the end of the day. And Prime Minister Trudeau has announced a two-stage tariff response, one stage immediate and then a bigger stage after a month, clearly hoping that the threat of retaliation will get Trump to back off a bit. And that may be one of the reasons that Trump delayed the tariff by 30 days. I think we could get more power if we were to look at non-tariff measures, different things that we could do to hurt American companies, especially those big technology companies that are very close to Trump. That could include in the resource sector, critical minerals, energy, oil, of course, either putting limits on how much we export or putting an export tax on it. Trump has said that he would tax energy 10%. He would put a tariff of 25% on everything from Canada except energy, which he really needs, would only get 10%. Well, many people, including Danielle Smith, the Premier of Alberta, have said we have to be fair and everyone has to bear their fair share of the burden here. So let's make it fair. Let's put a 15% export tax together with Trump's 10% tariff. That way energy gets the same 25% hit as everyone else. That's fair. But the difference is Canada gets to keep the money of the 15% rather than it being collected by Trump. And in fact, because energy is generally a provincial responsibility, it could be the province in each case, wherever the gas or oil or electricity was coming from, each respective province could keep the revenue. So it could be actually a beneficial scenario, as long as premiers like Danielle Smith are open-minded about trying to counter Trump's attacks rather than suck up to them and appease him, which is what Danielle Smith has been doing so far. There's other ways we could go after the big U.S. companies, including ripping up drug patents and other patents that protect their monopoly power, taxing their cross-border digital services. Let's take the digital services tax, 3% right now. Let's make it 25% to match Trump's tariff. That would make Netflix more expensive for Canadian consumers, but it would certainly get their attention. Other ways to limit the power and profits of American companies in Canada through regulations on foreign investment and so on. Of course, we can shift our own spending power towards Canadian products, and we've seen a lot of buy Canadian sentiment from Canadian consumers, which is great, and government procurement should as well. That's beneficial, but given the nature of the trade, we can't count on a buy Canadian movement to save us here alone, because most of what we buy from them, just like most of what they buy from us, is not final consumer goods. It's inputs to the overall supply chain. So we're going to need the structural power of government regulation, counter tariffs, and non-tariff measures to try and even the playing field here. And of course, we have to develop other markets for our stuff, other places to sell them. Not just other export markets like Europe or Asia or Latin America, but also expand the Canadian market for many of our high-value products. That's just the trade response, pushing back against Trump at the trade table. We're going to need a broader emergency plan as well if Trump goes ahead with this. And as I mentioned, even the threat of the tariffs has really put a chill into the minds of any company that wants to invest in North America. They're not going to be interested in Canada or Mexico right now. They'll be more interested in getting behind the tariff wall and putting their operations right in the U.S. So we are going to need massive emergency assistance for Canada's export industries to help them survive this, first of all, and then reorient their production and their marketing efforts and their supply chains. We're going to need emergency assistance for workers. We've been talking about how we need to fix our employment insurance system. We're going to need to do that quickly so that workers are protected who are laid off. And then possibly emergency measures like we had during the pandemic, the CERB, and all the other emergency programs. Those are things that Pierre Poilievre, in hindsight, has been lambasting, saying that they were a big waste. And they weren't. Those emergency programs during COVID saved us from a real depression. But now it's not hindsight anymore. Now it's a question of what are we going to do now, Mr. Poilievre? And his hatred of government support, I think, is going to be very vulnerable for him right now. We're already seeing him having big political problems because of what Trump is doing. And we should highlight that we need this support. And he has to abandon his criticism of government rescue efforts because we're going to need them again. In the long run, we're going to need something even more dramatic and in a way more challenging. For the last 35 years, the government has been saying the best thing about Canada is we're a nice country and we're next to the United States. Come and produce here and sell your stuff in America. And that argument doesn't work anymore. Again, even if Trump doesn't go through with the 25% tariff, the question mark about what he will do next has destroyed that argument. So we are going to need to present a different business case, if you like, or economic case, or a different model for how to develop our economy. In a way, we're going back to basics from Canada's history. We had a national policy in the 1870s when we were trying to create a viable country on the northern half of this continent that was more than just the northern annex of the United States. At a time when the government had tried to negotiate free trade with America under Alexander Mackenzie, but it failed. And the U.S. was trying to expand territorially at that time. So we said, we need tariffs on manufactured imports. We need no tariffs on inputs so that Canadian businesses can have access to inputs for their own operations. We need east-west infrastructure, including the railway, of course, now. But now we would need other forms of east-west infrastructure, like an integrated electricity grid, for example. And financial support for Canadian businesses and ways to develop a market for Canadian businesses. We're going to need something very, very much like that today, a new national policy, if you like. And the tools that we use will be different than the ones we used in the 1870s, but the vision motivating that strategy, that we're going to need a plan and intervention and rules in order to keep a Canadian economy that's independent and viable. That vision, that mission is still the same. One note of caution, we've heard some analysts and economists going on about how Canada needs to reduce barriers to trade between provinces as a way of responding to Trump. There are some sensible things that can be done in that regard, but most of the rhetoric on interprovincial trade is vastly, vastly overstated. There is no way that interprovincial free trade, as it's called, which is a bit of a misnomer, it's mostly about dismantling regulations in different provinces, things like occupational licensing, for example, for medical staff and so on. Those things, first of all, have some reasons, some rationale behind them, and just getting rid of regulations isn't going to save us from Trump. And the economic effects of doing that would be absolutely insignificant compared to the hit on Canada's economy from Trump's tariffs. So we have to be very cautious about some of the nonsense that we're hearing about how interprovincial free trade would save us. We have interprovincial free trade in Canada. You can move anywhere you want. We use the same money. You can sell products except wine anywhere you want. So the idea that these barriers, supposed barriers between provinces, are our biggest problem is just wrong. I was one of the people on these picket lines and protests against the original free trade agreement negotiated between Brian Mulroney here and Ronald Reagan. Came into effect in 1989. We argued that closer economic ties under a sort of corporate-dominated rule book would be very dangerous to our economy, to our independence, to our social programs, and indeed, ultimately, to our sovereignty. And lo and behold, it looks like we were right. Trump, however, has reinvigorated a sense among Canadians that we want to maintain an independent country. We want to be more than just the northern hinterland of the United States. And we've seen huge popular support for Canada and for the need to affirm a vision of Canada as a different country, an independent country. And we're a G7 economy with 40 million workers and consumers, and we've got huge resources and huge talent and huge knowledge and huge capacity to build a very successful independent country. So we're going to have to learn to stand on our own 2 feet again. Big risks in this moment, of course. People are in a way battered down by Trump's daily chaotic announcements, and this is part of his plan. In fact, this is how authoritarians have worked throughout history, to keep people off balance and scared and fearful of what's coming next, to undermine their willingness to stand up and demand something better. We, of course, enter this with great divisions in our political discourse and the rage farming of folks like Pierre Poilievre or Danielle Smith, trying to blame everything on the current prime minister and accepting the idea that somehow corporate leadership will make things more efficient rather than having an active government role to guide our economic development. That's going to fracture our response, and we've already seen that when Danielle Smith abandoned the other premiers, went to Trump to try to get a carve-out for Alberta, and it's not going to work for her. It's certainly not going to work for us. And then we're seeing all of corporate Canada line up and say this is the moment to have a dramatic pro-corporate restructuring of our society. These are things they wanted anyways. Get rid of the corporate tax, get rid of capital gains taxes, deregulate, reduce the power of workers and unions, reduce the power of environmental assessments on new projects. Things they wanted anyway. And now they're saying with Trump, we have to do it. And we have to push back against that. On the other hand, I think our history shows that if we had inspiring leadership, if we get Canadians together and organize them and inspire them and get them out in the streets and build alliances, with some of the unusual suspects that we might not usually talk to or hang out with, then we can absolutely pull together a critical mass to build a Canadian economy that's fair, inclusive, and prosperous well into the future. Thank you for watching. Please check out our website, centerforfuturework.ca, for our reports and commentaries, and you can sign up for our newsletter there. And please join the campaign for an independent, fair, and prosperous Canada in the future.